On this day, the 2nd of December, 1804, Napoleon Bonaparte was crowned Emperor of the French. Napoleon wanted to establish himself and his dynasty as legitimate in the eyes of the people of France and in the eyes of Europe as a whole. At this point, he had been in power for a few years as the first consul of the French Republic. And he decided at this point he wanted it all. He wasn't happy being just the first consul. He wanted to be the emperor. So, why emperor? Why not king? Well, throughout the past decade, it had been a bit chaotic in France. The king had been killed, the queen had been killed, their son had been abused to death. But the Bourbons were no longer seen as rightful kings by many people, or the rightful rulers. In many ways, they had lost what the Chinese called the mandate of heaven. It was almost as if they didn't deserve it because they ran off. They gave up. Whereas Napoleon was a great conqueror, a modern-day Alexander. So for him to claim the throne, an imperial throne, seemed apt, seemed natural, seemed good. There was even a referendum, and he put to the French, should I be the emperor? A vast majority said yes. Now, whether or not that was because people were stuffing ballot boxes, I have no idea. But it seems that there was some support for this. His own marshals, though, were a little bit more skeptical. Many of them were convinced Republicans. They'd spent years fighting royalists in France and fighting other kings around Europe. Most of them, however, when dangled in front of them titles of nobility, they changed their minds. Lands, houses, titles, it always gets them in the end, even if they are a convinced Republican. He wanted to differentiate himself from the old kings of France, especially from the Bourbons. He wanted this to be seen as something new, a new age, a new imperial age. So he was harking back to Rome, and he also, with some of the imagery, was harking back to the Merovingians in medieval France. This was a break from the old, but it evoked memories of the old. This was the future, and that is what he wanted everyone to believe. Pope Pius VII agreed to come to Paris to officiate at Napoleon's coronation. The Pope originally thought he'd be doing an old-fashioned sort of coronation, but Napoleon persuaded them to allow the introduction of several new elements. They were going to be singing in French, and they were going to be placing the sacred oil on his head rather than his neck. And there were a few other differences to the prayers, and so he wanted this coronation to be different from the old coronations, but also very much a coronation, but a new coronation. So Napoleon explained to be a king is to inherit all ideas and genealogy. I don't want to descend from anyone. And why should he? The conqueror of Europe, the ruler of France, the greatest military mind of his age. Why should he imitate the old, dead, loser monarchs of the Bourbons? So, the coronation day started early. Napoleon was at Tuileries, and he came to Notre Dame de Paris. Not Reims, as the French kings of old had done. That's where they had been crowned for many a century. Again, a break with tradition. The papal procession set out from the Tuileries an hour after Napoleon. When they arrived, Napoleon had on a white satin robe, and then he had an ermine cloak around him. Apparently it weighed about 80 pounds, so that would have been quite heavy. And unlike normal coronations, both he and Empress Josephine went through the ceremonies at the very same time. This was his great moment. So, once this had been done, he took the crown that had been made especially for him, because the old crowns of the French kings had been destroyed during the Revolution, and he placed it upon his own head. The Pope probably thinking, why did I bother to come? But he had all the great people of Europe around him. He had the Pope, the bishops. This was a good day for Napoleon. Another reason for this coronation was that he wanted to legitimize himself in front of the world, not just his own people. He wanted to impress and awe his allies and enemies alike. He was still fighting a war, especially with Britain. And next year was going to be his greatest victory. He was going to destroy the Royal Navy and invade Britain itself. Now we all know that this didn't happen. Trafalgar happened instead. And we know that he didn't stay on the throne for all that long. His lust for complete domination of Europe undid him. His imperial throne lasted only for his reign, and not his son's. He did have a nephew come to the throne eventually, the imperial throne. 1849 or something, somewhere around that. So a couple of decades later. And in many ways, Napoleon III ended up being a better ruler of France than Napoleon I, although he also lost his throne because of a stupid war he got involved in. But Napoleon III was no Napoleon I. And Napoleon I, no matter how great he was in many ways, he plunged Europe into a decade of conflict, and he ended up losing everything. Even at the end, after the Battle of the Nations at Leipzig, the Allies offered him a very good deal. They said that he'd keep his throne, he could remain in power, he could even keep much of the land that France had conquered. The Rhine would have been the eastern border of France. He would have kept Savoy and Nice in what became the Kingdom of Sardinia, which is now part of France. That's because of Napoleon III. And he would have been able to live out the rest of his reign and solidify his dynasty. Instead, he decided that he was going to fight and he was going to win. But that didn't work out. And then he was given another chance. Go back to the borders before the French Revolution. Again, he could have taken that and been Emperor of the French and continued ruling France. But he refused even that. And he was defeated and imprisoned on Elba. At this point, he was willing to accept the terms that had been offered to him. But people at the Congress of Vienna would have nothing of this. They refused it completely. And he was sent to St. Helena. So, this great coronation, this glorious, magnificent event in 1804, eventually, and inevitably I suppose, proved to be futile. But for that day, it would have been a splendid occasion. And for Napoleon, he would have felt this was the beginning of his dynasty. So on this day, the 2nd of December, 1804, Napoleon is crowned Emperor of the French.